I don't think it's gonna reach much.
This can pull further up though. Oh, maybe not because of that. Yeah, I bought stuff for Jennifer's daughter. I know, I forgot all about him. I'm like, somebody's gonna be excited. We look like we have seven.
All right, I will go ahead and call to order the Pinellas Continuing Care Board of Directors meeting for March 4th, 2022, and we will start with introductions to my left.
Good morning, Jennifer, to the Welfare Board.
Hi, Doug Cooley with the Pinellas Community Foundation and Chair of the Funders Council.
Kathleen Beckman, City of Clearwater.
Ross Silvers, PSTA. Renee Flowers, Pinellas County Commission.
Jennifer Strassick, Alpha House of Pinellas County. Dr. Gina Dean, Southern Supportive Services.
Glenn Wilder, Southern Supportive Services.
Trinity College Community, St. Petersburg, NAACP.
Michael Gelazzo, Perk.
Brianna Lipsky, the new senior administrative assistant.
Stephanie Reed, Chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee.
Kayla Saganowski, HLA. Natalie Pinella, HLA.
Avery Sliker, HLA.
Amy Foster, HLA.
Who do we have? Any board members?
We do. We have Costa. I'm not even going to try to pronounce Costa's last name. If you would like to introduce yourself, if you're
Vaticiotis. Just Coast is fine. Am I muted?
you're unmuted.
Okay, thank you.
We also
Can you
have-
hear me okay?
Can.
Okay, good.
We have Tawny Castle. We have April Lott, Karen Yachum, Teresa Jones, Shannon Walker, Larry MacArthur, Zach Page, Donna Hulk, Amy Davis, and Lou Richardson.
Walking in.
So they're doing introductions.
We also have Colonel Tom Gary.
Want to introduce?
I'm sorry, Florida person.
And Sean King, CFC Chair. So I was just talking to Amy about this. We have been well, Allendale, and I want to thank them for opening up their doors for us, because trying to find a place to meet, and this board is keenly aware we have to have some sort of in-person, be it Zoom because of sunshine. And at the time, Allendale was literally the only place in the county that opened their doors to us. It is a little difficult, the setup for a board meeting, specifically we're gonna have the church set up. So if anybody has any ideas or suggestions, maybe a mid-county space, there are some technology considerations. I'm just kind of throwing it out there. Yes, ma'am.
I've got two in Clearwater. There's the Unitarian Church, and there's also Trinity Presbyterian Church that are open. They have big spots, and we've talked to them recently about another nonprofit organization.
The board of realtors on homes.
That'd be a real good point. We've done meetings there too.
We have, yeah.
I mean, we're renovating a space, and when it's done, we'll have a big space at the Continental on 19 in Overton, but we're still a few months away. But sort of in the back of your mind, I mean, again, that's right in the middle of the county.
Yeah, we have an education center too that has.
Oh, yeah, why?
I don't know.
That's pretty big space.
I was thinking, honestly, I was thinking of a municipal building to yeah, let me check on dates and times, but we have the space and the technology.
And I kind of remember Mike Sutton on the record saying that he would make sure there was coffee and donuts. And
Yeah.
I recall, and I'm sure Michael will appreciate that I recall that.
I think we'll do mimosas on Fridays as well.
I can also speak to Largo about, we have several facilities that have conference rooms, so I can throw that out there as well.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like we have some leads, and I again want to thank Allendale and Methodist. We're not going anywhere, anything. So this is just kind of an idea. It is kind of difficult to operate a board meeting, but virtually and kind of without the table set up for everybody. So
Can I ask why did we just not? Because we met at hospice forever,
Hospice wouldn't allow people in anymore.
like
So,
ever, or because of the pandemic.
because of the pandemic.
I just wonder if that could be an option as we move forward.
I know the last time I checked, it still wasn't, but I can always check again.
the other consideration we want to probably have too is if policies in the past were to not let any visitors and things were to spike again, then we would be looking for another spot. So it's just, I'm just putting it out there and seeking ideas. And it's not going to be anytime soon. So we will run down some of the things and see where we can get a commitment, and probably at least what, a 12-month commitment. So if you're talking, probably. Okay, cool. Do we have any public comment? Either here or virtually?
I see Teresa.
I see, I was gonna say, where's Teresa? I know St. Pete just allocated some money yesterday, so I was waiting on that.
Thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak. I wanted to mention that there is an RFP on the streets from the city of St. Petersburg. It's ARPA funded, and the RFP is for wraparound services and case management for permanent supportive housing providers. And so that, I believe it's on the streets until the end of March. And if anyone is interested, they can see it on our procurement website, or I can send you the information. The city council approved additional ARPA funding to support development on the Deuces from ARPA funds as well. And there's also another RFP that was put out for scattered site family shelter, and that's going to city council for approval on March 24th. That's $2.5 million for a period, well, until the ARPA funds have to be expended, which is, I believe, December 2024. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Teresa. I hope everybody heard that, 2.5 million for scattered site. For all of our providers in the room or on Zoom. That's great news. So thank you to the city of St. Petersburg. Any other public comment?
I'll just mention, since Teresa didn't mention it, I only know because I read it in the paper today, but City of St. Pete did have diverse plans for their ARPA funds and decided yesterday to put all 45 million to affordable housing and housing issues. So who knows what that will look like yet, but I think that's something that we should celebrate, that we've advocated very loudly for the need for more housing, and our community voices are raising around that, and they're really leading the way with those dollars. So all the infrastructure projects that they had initially allocated will not happen, and they will all go to housing.
I just want to comment, you doing this for a long time, you're on city council, Commissioner Flowers. I think that your voices, that Councilmember Fig Sanders, that who've listened, right? And doing the public good, and I'm not, everyone who knows me knows I'm not like big on praise all the time, but we need to thank you. We need to thank Commissioner Flowers. I mean, Fig Sanders on city council. I mean, let's go through it. Kathleen Beck, even when Bob was on as part of this, that impact is really finally hitting home. And I just think that that's the way this is supposed to be. And I personally want to thank everyone for that, because even the conference that Commissioner Flowers really fought for, there was some great momentum from that. And that just is huge news. And I'm just going to stop. I'm all speechy.
Your feelings,
It's been outstanding. It's not about just impact. Look at the impact. That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's a day to celebrate. There's nothing in here.
And I think we have Councilmember Sanders on the Zoom. Councilmember?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much. And I apologize, I couldn't be there in person, but you know how life goes sometimes. But I really wanted to also make that announcement about all 45 million of the ARPA funds going to housing. But thank you so much, Mike, for those words. And thank you, Amy, for bringing that up. And thank you, Ms. Jones, for bringing that up. But I also wanted to thank Commissioner Flowers, because that was an awesome housing conference. And I'm hoping that all of you all that did not attend, that when she hosted again, please be there, because I felt so encouraged with where we are in the process of trying to get a collective effort for housing. So again, thank you for those words, Mike, because I wanted to say the same thing on those lines. But again, it looks like we are going to have some changes, and we still really do need to continue to have those voices. And it's organizations like this, and it's efforts like this that I've seen to be extremely, extremely helpful. So thank you so much for that.
I want to thank you for being a leader, and and I asked me to learn, so this is a good way for me to learn as well. But when St. Pete sets that bar as high as it can go, it allows me ammunition in Clearwater to say, what are we going to do now? Are we going to be dwarfed by this? And
I got to tell you, the conversation since St. Pete made the announcement went squarely to, let's start having those conversations with Chuck. Let's start really pushing the same way in Clearwater. And what you said is resonating on the street. And that's really powerful stuff.
Awesome, good news. And that's the importance of advocacy. And I know there was a lot of citizen engagement, specifically in St. Pete, to help to push and support. So thank you to everybody that came out to support that as well. We have a consent agenda. I will entertain a motion unless somebody wants something pulled.
Renee Flowers, the whole approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
We have a motion in a second. Any otherwise pulled?
I have one question. I rarely read
You read all of the agenda, we know.
No, about the minutes and tennis.
Okay, well, the minutes were terrible.
Oh.
I mean, I'm just gonna own it. I've been taking minutes without a Margie, and we forgot to record last time.
Oh.
So please give me any corrections. I was hoping people would remember things and give me corrections.
Well, it was just more like attendance. I swear I was in person on the 7th, but it doesn't matter. You got me down as virtual, but if
You were in person. We'll make that
because
change.
I usually try to make it here, but otherwise.
We can make that change.
We can make that. I mean, that's
Yeah,
more
oh,
of
that's
a
not
minute.
good. I mean,
Minute.
like I said, I rarely.
All right, so we have a motion second. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Nay. Hearing no nays, motion passes unanimously. We'll move on to the coordinated entry policy update for case conferencing, and I'll pass that over to Amy.
We'll let Carly take it.
All right, so we are making a few changes to our policies for coordinated entry for case conferencing, because now we have an entire, oh, sorry, I'll look at it too.
Now that we have a different way that we're doing them. So right now our policies show 4 tiers of case conferencing. We have tier 1, that's our by nameless meetings, where we go over the families that are already in coordinated entry and they're working their way through the housing program. We have our 2nd tier, and that's where providers get together once the client has been referred to talk about any of the barriers or whatever else the client might be facing and circumstances that they're in surrounding their situation. Then we have tier 3, and that's more of when maybe the client's really not being very successful in the program, and we need to make sure that they don't stay at risk for homelessness and return back to homelessness at that point, or back into the coordinated entry system for another referral. So then that's when providers get together. So then we have tier 4. Tier 4 is our emergency case conferencing. And at that point, we're having providers call the meetings themselves to advocate on behalf of clients that they were working for that are currently homeless and that were desperate in need of shelter. And so that tier 4 has changed because of the new process we have with our family flow. So now we have what's called our family shelter assessment. So when families are literally homeless, they can call 211 and get the family shelter assessment. It's scoring them or prioritizing them more based on vulnerabilities like disabilities, medical complexities, the ages of the children, or maybe there's someone elderly in the household and they're kind of prioritized in the order of the most need, right? If someone needs electricity, they're going to be a little higher. And that assessment places them on a prioritization list for shelter. And at that point, it becomes a coordinated entry system of shelter. So when a shelter has an open availability, we're basically matching a family to the perfect space. So if it's a family of 4 they need with maybe 3 small children instead of 2 adults and 2 kids, we can match that right away. And then the family can enter shelter and it would be a smooth transition, right? So the people on the list are kept up with to make sure that they still need shelter and such. But also, we're ensuring that every family on that list eventually gets case conferenced before they go into shelter, or if maybe they're really far down on the list, they might never enter shelter. And so everybody who's in an emergency will end up being case conference if they've called through to get on the shelter list, which of course they can do by calling 211. It only takes a couple minutes. So we're replacing tier 4 with our new model of how we're doing case conferencing now. So every Thursday from 3:30 to 4:30, we meet with providers. We have 211 because they're the assessors, and then we have some other people like DFL and their case managers and other programs that come together and kind of case conference the families. And we're basically collaborating together to talk about what are the true barriers of the current episode of homelessness for this family, and what can we do or offer them in this time, because sometimes there's one little piece of the puzzle that we're missing, right? And maybe it's just a referral somewhere, maybe for disability, if they have that money, they could get back on their feet. So we're working together to, build through those problems and make sure that they are all conferenced before they enter shelter if they never get that chance, because, we don't have the capacity that we should.
So I'll add on to that, just some additional commentary. First of all, I want to say that we have 74 families currently on the list that are literally homeless. These are not people couch surfing. They are people sleeping in places not meant for habitation. So that non-congregate shelter money that Ms. Jones mentioned can't come online soon enough. We've mentioned before that we've run through the DCF non-congregate shelter money. We had a significant discussion at the last Providers Council meeting about how we are going to conduct case conferencing moving forward, because people are at their wits' end, and no one got into this work because they were comfortable leaving a family on the street. And so tensions in those meetings have gotten challenging at times, providers not supporting each other, funders asking questions that are meant to help find resolution, but with, providers feeling like, oh no, if I say the wrong thing, we could lose our contracts, right? So we're working on a reset right now. We've asked funders to not attend those meetings for a little while, and we are getting the providers shored up to feel comfortable with doing good case conferencing. Last week, we did norm setting and had some discussions around that. Yesterday, we had the most beautiful example of case conferencing. I'm so proud of all of our providers, really looking at strength-based questions. We kind of changed the question from how can we get that family shelter today, because there's not space, to what can we do today to help this family. We found so many solutions that we wouldn't have found without everyone in the room. And so, I mean, I have goosebumps. It was such a good meeting. We actually got one family into shelter, and that was because multiple providers advocated and used their voice. We had another family week case conference that we did not get into shelter, but we were able to think of some other solutions for that family. That is family number 74 on the list. And just to give you an idea, it is a struggling single mom who is sleeping either in an abandoned apartment or in someone's back porch with a son, juvenile justice involved, and she is trying to keep him out of trouble. So that gives you a sense of that was the least vulnerable on the list. So we are at a crisis moment. We think that we are going to see about 10. This is new, less than a month old, so it's hard to know what the trend line is going to be. Certainly that trend is lower at the beginning of the month than the end of the month, because families can kind of get by for some of the month sometimes, but I'm thinking it's going to be about 10 a week that come into our system. So, you know, we're looking at quite a few people, even with that money coming online. It'll be months and months before we get people into shelter. So I just wanted to thank our providers for their staff's problem solving and willingness to participate in this process. Funders have also been very interested, and even though they're not at the table, they're asking me every week, where are we? What are the numbers? We want to understand the problem. So they are not disengaged, and we will reintegrate the group at some point after we get our processes all ironed out, so everybody feels comfortable. So I'm just really proud of the work that our community is doing, even though it is certainly uncomfortable for anyone to have to leave a family on the street.
So you said we currently have 74 families that are literally homeless, and that you are thinking about 10 additional families are coming
a week.
10
a week are being assessed right now.
Okay. And we found shelter for that one example this Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
So the number's at 73 with 10 per week. And then what do we see in the future is when those funds come in from St. Pete, so where are we looking to put these families?
I mean, it would everything that's on the street right now, there's the city of St. Pete money that Teresa spoke of, and then there's some other contracts that are being worked through. They're all non-congregate, so that would be hotel, motel, or apartments. And, you know, apartments, even though those I think are the preference, they're not easy to come by. They were the preference, I think, in the city's initial RFP. So.
This is the appropriate reasons, but I do know that I've been trying to work with the county to allow our dollars to be used for those in hotels and motels, because that is their address. And so at our workshop yesterday, after much discussion, staff brought back some language, so it will be on our agenda to pass on Tuesday to allow for those dollars to be spent for persons living within hotel motels, specifically adhering to the language that's in the funding allocation. So, and Amy may have more specifics on that language, but I believe one of them is it needs to be some form of a kitchen.
I don't know all the specifics. The part I can share, so this is related to ERA expenditures. It is allowed under ERA to pay for hotel when that is somebody's residence. One of the challenges I think the county was experiencing around that was, is a lease required? I think at this point they've worked through that, and the determination is if somebody's been in hotel for 30 days, that is their residence. They do not need a lease. They'll use, you know, payment backup to prove that, and then be able to use ERA dollars to pay moving forward.
Just one, on the form that was in the agenda, tier 4, right after Carly's email, is emergency case case consultations will be called, not be called later than 6 p.m. Just the language.
Thank you, Duncan.
About us, putting these families in hotels because we don't have apartments, which I understand. But you kind of mentioned something about needing a kitchen or something. If they're in a motel without a kitchenette or something, I mean, their costs just rise. Their health is impaired with crappy food when you're not, cooking your own. So
I think Jennifer. might be
Yeah,
able to
so
say
in
that.
at least like St. Vincent's non-congregate programs, we can do that, like they're delivering meals depending on the hotel that they're in. So it does, it's an extra cost, especially if you're doing delivery and meals on wheels and stuff like that. So that is an element that whenever we're doing non-congregate, I can, with other companies, think about it and the expense as well.
I noticed, I was coming down 34th Street and there are a couple of motels on the right-hand side, right before 38. And I noticed even the Pinellas CoC schools meal delivery coming out of one of those hotels one morning, and I could see the people walking back to their room. So that's really good to know.
I do think that is an area that any kind of alignment is helpful. So I want to thank JWB. They were the first that required that in their contract, that meals be delivered. We did put that as a recommendation in our written standards for non-congregate shelter. And I know that JWB and the county have been working very closely to align the Family Bridge program with, so it's the same, right? So if anyone else funds non-congregate shelter, meals are certainly something that has to be thought through for how that will be provided. And just trying to make sure our hybrid environment is interactive as possible. Teresa is stating that there's a need for additional funders to fund rapid rehousing and temporary financial assistance. Homeless families can't languish in hotels and shelters forever. And the only local funders for RRH are Pinellas County and St. Petersburg.
Do we have any questions or anything else about the kids conference?
So help me out, I'm just still learning all this good stuff. So is the trend of 10 families a week that we're projecting, is that being driven by the end of the moratorium on evictions as part of COVID?
I think that's some of it. I think rising rents is a large part of it. I think that's one of the challenges that we're trying to get to, because this is less than a month old, is what is driving that. But rising rents are a huge part of it as well.
And I would add that we've made it more accessible. So maybe there were more homeless families we couldn't capture, but now that we have a better front door, that it's easier to get in the system.
So the difference, Ross, to help explain, so before, families would call every shelter in town and get put on a list, right? And they weren't ever assessed to enter the homeless system, because sitting on the list for shelter doesn't get you on the list for permanent housing, which is what our goal is. And so now, instead of every shelter having to keep their own list, we are keeping the list. And then they are also being assessed, if they are literally homeless, to be awaiting permanent supportive housing, or not supportive, sorry, permanent housing of any type, right? Whatever the resolution that's appropriate for that family.
And then speaking of that front door, once upon a time, it was hard to get through 211. And so I'm hearing call as being the interaction. I know that text is now available. So is it hard still at certain times to get through 211? Can someone text and have someone from 211 call them back, or is that unnecessary?
I have to have Nikki speak to that, and there are definite changes coming with 211 with the FSI being removed from that. So I think that's going to be a work in progress. I do know they were supposed to re-implement texting. I can tell you that we are tracking our own referrals. We do not have a live phone line that anyone answers. And this month we saw a really interesting change. We're getting about 400 referrals a month. And typically half of those, let's say, comes from other agencies. This month that tanked and self-referrals went up, which tells me that people are just calling wherever. Because if it was a good referral that we could have done prevention and diversion with, 211 or partner agencies would have called us. Instead, it's self-referrals because they're not getting help somewhere. So we're gonna have to continue to look at that.
Any other comments or questions? So I just have kind of stuff that I want to highlight on there. I mean, this is what the COC is about, and this is what we're here for to do is these kinds of actions. The case conferencing is really breaking down the silos that existed within our own continuum of care. That's what I see in this, is saying, hey, let's get the providers talking about these cases and seeing what kind of resources we can bring to bear, no matter who the client may be referred from or whatever the case may be. So this is a definite positive step in the right direction in my opinion, and from what we've been hearing has bared some fruit, and hopefully will continue to. So thank you for working on this HLA and bringing this policy forward to us. With that, I will entertain a motion. I know we have a little bit of an amendment. And a motion from Sam, we have a second from Biden. Any further discussion? Seeing or hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Saying nay. Hearing no nays, motion passes unanimously. Thank you for your work on that. Okay, we'll move on to HMIS policy and procedure updates, and I believe that's Avery.
Good morning. So coming out of the Homeless Management Information System Governance Committee is your annual approval of the policies and procedures. Those of you that are new, the Homeless Management Information System, which we call HMIS, that is our database. That's where all the data is collected and processed and everybody enters it. We have around 600 end users that are entering data every year. So the policy updates, very briefly for you, were some clarification provided in the licensing fee, just making sure that we separated out, the licensing fee versus the administrative fee. We updated consent. We have combined the release of information with the informed consent, so it is one form now. We did put some additional clarifying information in that policy after Providers Council. We updated method for securing verbal releases. We revised the corrective action on what's the policy for inactivity. If somebody, an end user, has been active for 30 days, they're going to be suspended. After 60 days, before they are put back into the system, they have to do another training. We did an annual refresher for data quality. We entered all the benchmarks that you all approved. And we also added a new policy for benchmark and the qualities, which is a zip code data policy. HMIS currently does not collect zip code data, and it's making targeted decisions a little bit difficult. So we decided as the Data System and Performance Committee to create a very brief policy on zip codes and how to enter that data. This will go into the new HMIS system administrator meeting, so they will be trained there. And there will be another training for all end users after that. And then hopefully as of April 1, we'll be getting zip code data. Fingers crossed. And then probably the largest new thing to the policies and procedures is clarification on reporting and the request for customized reports and customized assessments. Due to the amount of time that this customization can take based on the complexity of it, we are going to have to start charging. If these reports fall out of the realm of what is a normal report request or an assessment request. And what is considered within that scope is it's going to be If it's an existing provider report or a local customer report or an HMIS vendor report, those are usual normal reports. Absolutely request those. That's why we're here. A customized report, though, it goes beyond that normal scope. You're looking at using multiple complex calculations, which means we have to pull multiple queries out of the HMIS database, which can be difficult. Just so everybody knows, with the current system that we have through WellSky, that can be very difficult at times, and it is extremely time consuming. So there is a new policy in regards to a fee structure for requesting those reports. These policies and procedures are coming to you not only from HMIS governance is approved, but also from Providers Council is approved.
So with that, it's been vetted by school committee, so only need a motion. So I will ask for a motion to approve. Do we have any discussion or comments? Okay, seeing or hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed signify by saying nay. Hearing no nays, motion passes unanimously. Thank you for all your hard work and all the committee's hard work on that. And we will, I guess, have you stay up and we'll move on to the race equity toolkit.
This has been a labor of love for your diversity and equity and inclusion committee. We've been working on this now for maybe a year. It's been about a year. It's been a year. So this is part of our strategic plan. This came out of the race disparity study and the need for having help for providers, because more and more funders are requesting that providers provide evidence of race equity policies and procedures within their RFPs and RFIs. Now, HUD has not made this request yet. However, being in the different conferences that we have been in within the past month, I believe that with our new NOFO, we are going to have much stronger language in regards to what is a continuum of care doing to ensure equitable processes within the continuum. So this is hopefully going to be a resource for all the providers. It has been adopted from the Housing Development Consortium, which is from Seattle, Kings County, who is HUD's favorite best practice and promising practices, continuum of care. Also from the Washington Race and Justice Initiative. Again, that too was selected as a best practice for anyone out there doing race equity work. We combined what we liked of those two toolkits, and that's what you've got. It has been broken down into education, and that is history of fair housing and even a little bit of Pinellas County history. We've got the power of language, where we have inserted your already approved glossary of shared language. Identification, within there, we've got some program and project design through an equity lens. How do you do that? We have securing organizational commitment, and that is, how do you get organizational commitment around a more equitable culture? Hiring and retaining a more diverse workforce and transforming that impact. Then we did creating and implementation. This is the assessment. It is big. Forewarning you, I've been over this with Providers Council. It's big, it's long. The nice thing about this toolkit is that a provider can take their time. Making a large organizational change for racial equity cannot happen overnight. Providers can determine how much or how little of this assessment they're going to complete. How much or how little of a plan are they going to develop? It can be based on their own timeline and time frame. And then within the appendix, we've got all kinds of good kind of best practices for them. There's role playing activities. That's where we put the assessments and the different plans and templates that can be made. How do you do partnerships within the community based around equity? And again, this is being brought to you, approved by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and the Providers Council.
Again, coming out of 2 committees, so I will entertain a motion. Do we have any discussion?
Yeah, one point on the assessment piece that I thought was really interesting. I found this question challenging when I did point time count as well. And sort of where do you speak? Is this part of that assessment, or is this is all that's part of the next? Where
That's part of the next one.
Okay.
You jump ahead.
Don't want to do that.
We always take that ahead.
Withdrawn.
Do we have anybody online?
We do not.
So this is just a best practice to be published. How are we going to publish it, or what is that going to look like? How are we going to work with that?
I was hoping somebody was going to ask that question. We are going to be doing a virtual Toolkit 101 through the Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Committee. Part of our strategic plan is to do an annual virtual event, much like we did last year, where we went through the study that had been completed and it's in steps and some takeaways. So what we want to do annually is do a virtual and say, okay, this is where we are, not only with our steps that we put together as continuum of care or as a committee within our work plan, but also here's something you can have and do something tangible. So this year's virtual equity workshop will actually be taking people through this toolkit, how it can be utilized, how it can be pulled apart and personalized for each organization. And then also the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee is going to be hosting some one-on-one TAs. So if an organization is kind of struggling with something, or they want to say, hey, look, take a look at what we've created. What do you guys think about that? We're going to open up quarterly at the end of our meetings, the time for you to come and talk to us. Talk to the full committee, and we'll start publishing those once we get the schedule down.
I think the other thing I would say is I think one of the things that has made our COC so powerful is alignment. And, you know, many COCs across the country do not have the alignment that we have, particularly with our funding community. And so the next step is for funders to use this kind of thing to hold organizations accountable. And our goal is always that we are providing resources and advanced time for organizations to get up to speed before funders start holding them accountable for that. So we know that HUD is going to start doing that, and we're going to see more and more of that. We have local funders who are already kind of starting to at least get baseline information in this area. And so, you know, that's kind of a next step for that particular role, is that funders now will know that these resources are available and that TA is available. And so they, at some point, will be able to ask more specific questions in their RFPs around this.
Also, data system performance and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committees had their first joint meeting. Dr. Reed joined our data system performance meeting this past month, where we were talking very loosely and broadly about looking at our data from within a race equity lens, and is there a potential in the future to be developing some benchmarks for the continuum of care.
And
I just want to ask this question, sort of philosophical, as I'm, you know, making my way as a council member. But so our DEI looks at race equity and how we are serving the people who are in need in our community. One of the things I'm noticing as I serve on council is when it becomes apparent to me, when we send out our responses, sometimes we get responses with big projects and they attach their board of directors, these are the board of directors, and they put pictures of them. And to me, when they attach that, and I look through the agenda, I'm like, wow, this last Monday, the firm had 11 or 12 people identified. They were all Caucasian and one was female. And the female is the one who answers the phones. She has a fancy title, but when you call her, that's what she was there for. And, I'm wondering how we can be intentional with who we contract with as well. I mean, if they're going to put that information out there as who we are, I don't have the time to go and Google up somebody's, leadership council and all of their demographics, but I asked our city attorney about putting a statement in to our RFPs that we value diversity in the firms we do business with. Now, we can't necessarily grade it or something, but just to put people on notice that I'm looking at that and it's important to me. And you should be aware that people are looking for diversity in your leadership. So.
Councilmember Beckman, I would guess that both Commissioner Flowers and Councilmember Deborah Fix-Sanders might have some ideas for you from what they're doing in their jurisdictions that may be able to be applied in Clearwater that could help with that.
Yeah, just, I know sorry. Reach out. Yeah. It's the way you can do it, so really.
Yeah. And if I may, the city of St. Petersburg has really been a leader in the promotion of diversity and in their RFPs for requesting funding for social application funding. There's a weight attached to diversity. So that's been in place for some time because I serve as their chair. So it is weighted. So the value is there and the accountability is there.
To include the board, because they'll ask me what is the makeup of the board.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I chair the social action funding. And there's a percentage of minority representation. And we even got so specific because some people were asking an African-American woman because we serve two categories. A woman and an African-American, and we're like, no. So we can, I'm sorry.
No, I knew y'all would have some help to offer.
It's the creative ways to make it happen.
Meaning, okay.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
I think the toolkit's excellent, and I think if we're doing the work to make a good training event, I think it's really worth thinking through how we can share that as a resource for other organizations, including those that are not homeless focused. And I'm thinking about the health system, for instance, we're doing some diversity equity inclusion work. I think most big corporations are doing that with some degree of authenticity, a large variety of that. But I think having good resources available that will help people think through these questions in a smart, authentic, and intelligent way would be valuable to a lot.
Yeah, I actually agree with, there are, and you mentioned the appendices, some really good stuff to help any organization, but I'm trying to think of the last time I've written a grant that it wasn't asked. We're seeing it in funding everywhere where they want to know the makeup of our board, they want to know the makeup of, and we have the data, we track that, but I think it's just kind of part of doing business now.
I'm used to that as well. I was shocked at some of the recent conferences that we are unique in that category. We should be really proud of the work that we're doing here in Pinellas County. And I largely believe that's due to all the conversations that the Foundation for Healthy St. Pete has started and the work that Pinellas Community Foundation has done around that. And our funders, City of St. Pete, ask those questions early on. It helps us be a little bit ahead of the curve.
So I just want to kind of bring it back and thank the board because this is coming from, this started really, I think in 2019 when and I see Deborah has her hand up, but and it started before that when we were really looking through a race equity lens and what we could do. We set up, we set up an ad hoc committee, and then we made that an actual committee of the board, and then they obviously got to work and have done a lot of heavy lifting. So I want to thank everybody who who supported that along the way, and the committee members who have worked diligently to provide this toolkit. And to Sam's point, this goes beyond just the homeless or the COC. This could be used by any organization. I know I have a lot of conversations, and people are, some people are like, I don't even know where to begin. Like, I want to, but where do I begin? So we can point them directly, I'm assuming, right to the website.
Once you approve it, of course.
And so this is a great thing, and hopefully, we can share this as a shining example for what our COC has done around the state. And I want to go to Councilmember Fix Sanders, who has her hand raised virtually.
Thank you so much. And Sean, I concur with everything that you said. And I wanted to also piggyback on what Amy said. With all the progress that we've made in DNI, a lot of that, especially for the city of St. Petersburg, I want to really credit it to the fact that representation matters. When you have those that are so diverse sitting at the table with leadership abilities and decision-making authority, you see things like this come together a lot faster and a lot more cohesiveness. And the example that COC is setting truly could be one that is commendable. So again, I just wanted to piggyback on what Amy said, but thank you, Sean, for reiterating and supporting where we are with the DE&I committee. And I really do enjoy serving on that committee. Thank you.
And I would also be remiss if I didn't, Trinity has been pushing us towards this way, and Teresa Jones, if I didn't say, she's been a large advocate for getting our board more diverse and bringing people to the table. And so thank you both for that. So we do have a motion on the floor. Any other comments or questions? Hearing and seeing none, I will call for a vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed signify by saying nay. Hearing no nays, the motion passes unanimously, and we will move on to Dr. Reed with the coordinated entry assessment update and presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, great. So thanks for accepting and passing the DI racial equity toolkit. That has been a labor of love, and so we thank you for the support on that. That's kind of the meat and potatoes of the next thing that I want to present about the equitable prioritization assessment. So I was contracted by HLA to look at and have conversations with COCs across the country to understand what it is that they're doing to prioritize equity in their prioritization assessment. You probably are very familiar with the study that came out by C4 Innovations a couple of years ago. Yeah, about a couple of years ago now, where they found that there were inequities that were created and perpetuated by the VI for that tool. And so as a COC, we wanted to look at our process specifically and our use of the tool and decide how do we need to move that forward toward equity. But we needed to start that by looking at what other organizations, what other COCs across the nation were already doing to move their tools toward prioritization and equity and prioritization. You can go on to the next slide. So if this is kind of small for you all here, but it's in your packet. If you look at this framework or this process flow, this is a process flow created by the National Alliance to End Homelessness, where they're looking at racial equity in the coordinated entry process, and they're showing where in the process that inequities can happen, where disparities can happen. When we're talking about disparities, we're talking about differences in how people are prioritized by race, by ethnicity, differences in how people are receiving services by race and ethnicity. Go into the next slide. In the next slide, we're looking at how specifically the prioritization phase can create inequity. So what's getting us, who's getting assessed, which populations has the community decided to prioritize, what role does the tool score play in prioritization? And in the next slide, is focusing on the process. So these are the two areas where my assessment scan kind of honed in on to look above, looking at the whole process flow of where disparities can happen. I targeted these areas. So specifically though, even more than just the prioritization phase, it's the tool itself. So who's administering the tool? Who's getting assessed? Must someone come into an office to be assessed? How long is the tool? Specifically, you know, how many questions there are, how long does someone have to sit and answer questions? When is the tool administered? Is it administered as soon as someone is engaged, or is there rapport building time? And I'll get into that in a little bit. And what is being measured with the tool? So specifically, what questions are being asked? And is there a need to even ask some of those questions? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I was contracted to talk to COCs across the nation, and I began this assessment back in August of 2021. And it spanned actually from August until just last month when I had my last conversation. Some of the COCs were more difficult to schedule with, but they were held over Zoom or phone calls. Some chose to only correspond by email, and I kind of take that from the perspective of some just weren't as far along, or may not have had time because there was also COVID going on with the pandemic, presented some challenges for many folks. But I did have conversations with several of the COCs, and the specific questions that were asked, and these were the basis of the questions. There were more questions that were asked based on the conversation. What assessment tool did the COC use to prioritize people for services? Have they identified any issues of inequities with their tool? What other criteria have they implemented to assess vulnerability and to prioritize individuals? And what have been the impacts of utilizing those criteria? I also had conversations with persons with lived experience, which I'll get into as well. In total, there were about 11 COCs that were contacted. There were a few COCs that did not respond. Specifically, Hillsborough County did not respond to me. Volusia, Flagler County, and Volusia County and North Carolina, Guilford County did not respond. On this slide, you can see the COCs that I spoke with, and this is just a slide that shows the specific tool they're utilizing, the approach they've had thus far, or that they're considering, because some folks haven't even started to, at that point, hadn't really framed out how they were going to move forward in creating a tool or making the process more equitable. So it's looking at their approach, their composition of the work group, if they had formed one, and the status at that point of where they were in reassessing their prioritization process and their actual tool for equity. So I spoke to Knoxville, Tennessee, COC. They're using the DS for that. Their approach is to be culturally sensitive, to consider vulnerability and the way people, the questions that are asked and how that makes them vulnerable, and their vulnerability with being homeless, and equity is a consideration for them. Their work group was composed of frontline assessors, managers, and persons with lived experience, but in the second phase of their process. So the second phase being reviewing questions or reviewing the process after it's been created by frontline assessors and managers. And they're still learning from other COCs, and they're learning from how to participating in technical assistance workshops. Charlotte-Mecklenburg County was a lot further ahead, I should say. They were still planning to use the DS for that. They still are using the DS for that, but they created a set of supplemental questions. And their supplemental questions really spoke to areas that were determined in research that showed that how structural racism impacted the individuals in their COC. So they created the list of supplemental questions to be asked along with the questions and the DS for that, to give weight and consideration to how structural factors impact individuals of color in their COC. Their work group was composed of persons on the Equity and Inclusion Committee, the Coordinated Entry Oversight Committee, frontline workers, but not assessors in the beginning, persons with lived experience, persons that worked in the Veterans Administration, a student that was from UNC Charlotte, who was doing their thesis work on the homeless system in Charlotte. And they also included assessors in the test phase. They piloted their tool, collected data because they wanted to make sure they weren't implementing a tool COC-wide that still had issues and was still perpetuating inequities. They implemented their supplemental questions back in October. They started October 8th of last year. And I spoke with them just recently, about 3 weeks ago. They're at this phase now where they want to do some research, collect data on the supplemental questions to see which of those supplemental questions actually are helping them to understand how inequities can be perpetuated in their system. Because that list of supplemental questions is very long, so they also feel the need to shorten that. I spoke to a person from Polk County. They're still using the VS for that. They are considering equity. They're looking for an alternative, but they haven't figured out the way to get started. So, as we think about the toolkit that was just adopted, that kind of toolkit is useful because people feel stagnant. They feel like, how do I even understand the breadth of how inequities even were created in this nation? So the toolkit is valuable for that and for others who are experiencing that kind of stagnation. Spoke to Mississippi, COC 501. They're using the VS for that. And interestingly enough, that was a COC where they determined they weren't experiencing the same inequities that the C4 innovation study had highlighted. They looked at their data and they said, well, we are prioritizing the individuals who are most vulnerable in terms of race and ethnicity. But they did also look at their process, and they were at that point looking at how they were interacting with the individuals who were homeless. They made sure that they were hiring individuals that were in the communities that were touching the people that were from that specific community. They made the language applicable, so they changed some of the language. For instance, the question about going to jail or being in going to prison. They said that some people didn't admit or say yes to the word, yes, I've been in prison, because the word that they were more comfortable with or that they were using more often was jail. So they used language, they used people that were in the community that were familiar with how language was used in that community to ask questions and to frame the questions that way. So they didn't always have to say verbatim, like on the VS that how the question is written. They allowed them to use the word in the language that was most comfortable for the people that were interacting. They also use monthly case conferencing in addition to VS for that score. So they have a process where individuals, providers from the community meet monthly and talk about those who may not have risen to the top in terms of their score. They didn't have a score that would prioritize them for housing right away. And that to me is also a fallacy of VS for that, right? Because they now have added on to that process to say that I know, I as the person who's done this assessment, know a little bit more about this client. And so I can give a little more information to help get them priority to be housed. So that was their way of adding on to that process so they could prioritize people who needed the priority the most. As I mentioned, they were already looking at equity. They were already, they had already done some work and looked at how the VS for that score was trending in their community for people of color. But they continue to train on administering the tool equitably and incorporating those types of practices where they're looking at language and looking at the individuals who are doing the assessment and making sure they have an equitable, connection, because they're people that they're using the same language and are from the community. I also spoke with Chattanooga, Tennessee, COC 500. They're using the VS for that. Equity is their approach, of course. And I have to say, I framed the conversation from equity. So, it's also, yes, this is what I'm gonna say, because that's the key word. That's the key word, the word that's popular right now. So they already knew that was how I was approaching the conversation. So I'm hopeful that they were honestly and authentically looking at equity in how they were approaching their toolkit. If not, or their tool, if not, it's on their radar now and they're thinking about it But they did say they have a CES committee, coordinated entry system committee, and they're looking for someone with lived experience. I did ask the question about inclusion of people with lived experience to understand how they were incorporating community voice and the voice of persons with lived experience in developing their tool and their process. But as the time I talked with them, they were still using the VI for that. King County was a CFC that I desperately wanted to talk to. I think we had 5 meetings set up, and unfortunately, every one of them was postponed and canceled, pushed off. I attributed that partly because they had a new director that was in place, and that director he was getting his feet under him. They had several meetings that came up where it pushed off my meeting with them. So, but I did do some research online and pulled their rubric. Really, it's their rubric. It's not their questionnaire, but it's their rubric that shows how they score people based on each category that they ask about in their prioritization assessment. Their tool is a highly rated tool in that it was designed specifically to assess who's most likely to be taken advantage of or harmed on the streets in their community. And the process that they use to administer their tool was developed by people in the community, people who had worked in the homeless system, and people who had lived experience. And it was honed and tested. There's several validity studies on that tool. So the tool has been proven to be very effective and useful for prioritizing individuals. We did use that tool, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, to help us, not their tool, but their rubric to help us think about how we phrase questions and how we're assessing as well here locally. Austin, Texas developed a tool called the Austin Prioritization Index. They looked at questions on the VIX to that to see specifically which questions were more likely to be answered yes by LGBTQ communities and people of color, specifically Black people. Initially, when I read about their assessment and their process for developing their tool, I was a little concerned because I thought, well, are we moving so far to only take yes questions and keep the yes questions, and then limiting the ability of other people who have vulnerabilities and need housing, specifically medical conditions or other conditions, and now they're not getting prioritized. But in the conversation I had with Austin, I was very much relieved to know that, yes, they still kept the questions that were prioritizing people that had medical issues. They consider medical vulnerability a serious area and needed to continue to prioritize that. But they did want to hone in on the questions where people of color, Black people, LGBTQ, were willing to say yes to, because they wanted to elevate those people in the need for being prioritized for housing. They included Black and brown people, people with lived experience, members of the LGBTQI community in their process. And it wasn't just people that worked for ECHO, it was people that lived in the community or people that really wanted to be a part of this process. And they implemented their tool back in October of last year. They are also in the process of doing some research on their questions, making sure their questions are continuing to perpetuate equity. And as soon as they implemented that tool, though, they did see that there was more equity in terms of who was being prioritized, and there were more people of color getting housed and being available services. The National Health Care for the Homeless Council is one that's not a COC, and it seems out of place, but I had connections with them from previous work and learned that and so I reached out to them, not even knowing that they were doing anything, just to see if they had ears on the ground about others who were doing this type of work, who are already working on the prioritization process. And so it actually kind of surprised me that they were doing their own work as a council to look at how they could develop a toolkit to help communities develop a prioritization assessment tool based on factors in their community. So they didn't want to create a tool to replace the VS for that and then say to every COC, here, take this tool and apply it in your community. They wanted to develop a process, much like the toolkit we just talked about, where they could give something to a COC to say, these are the things you should consider as you go about the process of creating your toolkit. So they're in the process of doing the same thing that I was doing, of talking to COCs across the nation, figuring out where they are in the process. So we were able to collaborate and share some references, and some of these people I actually got from them. So they're still in the process of developing that tool, and I'm going to be interested to go back and see what they end up with in the end. Volusia County is still also using the VS for that. They're utilizing HUD-TA. They're using a work group to look at coordinated entry process and working on their assessment. They met bi-weekly to look at their process and to determine whether changes were needed. Their work group was composed of members of the CES committee, a consultant, community members, and as of the time I spoke with them, they were still working on their assessment. So let me know. That's right. I don't want to go over time. So as I was saying through in some of what I talked about with the COCs, many communities hadn't even started yet. They were still in the process of, oh, the Viascadad is being sunset. I have to do something. What are we going to do? So they were thinking through that. Some COCs were taking the supplemental questions approach. They chosen to supplement Viascadad, keep the Viascadad as it is, and then create a supplemental tool. And then some supplemented the process by using case conferencing to supplement what the score alone did not indicate, and sharing assessor observations made during the assessment. So some tools actually had space in there for the assessor to say, you know, especially if someone didn't say that they were that they had substance abuse issues. The assessor could make an observation about whether they thought that person did or not. And then some COCs actually sought to replace and overhaul the tool to minimize inequities. The process and approaches varied, as I mentioned, but the work was grounded in many cases within the COC, within the community, among academics. In the case of Knoxville, Tennessee, and in Charlotte, they had an academic component, and some had a combination of a few of those factors. There were very localized approaches, as I mentioned, with Mississippi, for example, that recognize the importance of language. They used questions that the local community responded to, and that were more likely to say yes to, like in the examples of Austin, Texas, and Mississippi. They hired staff from the communities that were being served, so people felt rapport, felt more comfortable. They removed re-traumatizing questions. So this was the case in North Carolina, where there were questions they realized even in their piloting phase from their questions that they were traumatizing. And that wasn't the intent, of course, of the prioritization process. We don't want to traumatize. So they removed those and in some cases reframed or created different language so they could actually get what was necessary from that question or what is needed for prioritization. And inclusion of persons with lived experience in local communities, but different COCs did that to varying extent. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I spoke to individuals with lived experience, and my intent was to speak to at least 10 people. I went into this thinking it's going to be so easy, right, during COVID, to speak to people with lived experience. But I was able to speak to 2 people with lived experience. I worked with providers in the community to say, you know, help me identify individuals who are willing to talk about their experience and willing to share what the prioritization process was like for them. And as I mentioned, I spoke with 2. There was one person that had been rapidly rehoused in a program in Pinellas County, who I spoke with, and her experience was that she was very hesitant to answer questions. And I should also share that I'm speaking with her months after she's already been housed. She's now stable. She was a person who had a son who had to escape a situation, and she was rehousing, so it's months that have passed. But with my interaction with her, the conversation I had, initially she was very hesitant to answer even the questions that I was asking about her experience. And that spoke to me about her just comfort with even sharing that she had been homeless. She was she shared a lot about, that was just one situation. I'm stable now. That's not me. This has never happened to me. And then I began to ask her about the questions themselves. And I'll say that I spoke with her for about 45 minutes, and it took some time for her to even begin to feel comfortable sharing with me. But as I share with her to say, there are other people like you that have experienced this, because she was thinking about it from, a person that you see on the street that's homeless, and, how what people have in their minds a lot of times that aren't working internally in the system about who a homeless person is. And she even had that stigma about homelessness for herself. And so it took some time for me to help her understand that there are others like you that we want to understand and learn from, so that we can make the process more equitable for everyone, for people who are working and who just have something happen in their lives that makes them vulnerable to homelessness. And so as she began to reflect on the questions, her thought process was, yes, I remember that question. And I kept saying, that's not me. She was telling herself, that's not me, that's not me. So she felt stigma even in answering the questions on the Fiesta. So that was very telling. There was another individual I spoke with who actually was still at the time homeless, and he was trying to get anything he could. He was trying to help, get his family house. He had children, and in my conversation with him, I could hear and feel the desperation. He was just desperate for any help he could get, and perhaps he thought I was someone who could also help him in his immediate need. And so his approach to me in answering my questions, and even I learned with the assessor, was that I just tell them everything I can. I just need help. He's willing to answer any question that's thrown at him. And so, while those are only two people, those are anecdotal, it's very telling about how people perceive the process. And it's also very telling about how vulnerable people are in the midst of being homeless, and how long it may take someone to even feel comfortable sharing their true and actual experience going through that process. Because I can imagine maybe 6 months, a year removed from his experience, he may reflect on his experience and the questions he was asked very differently than he did in the immediacy of his need. So on to the next area. So I also spoke to assessors in Pinellas County. So those who are actively administering the Fiesta Dash. Next slide. I held focus groups or individual meetings with 7 stakeholders across 4 agencies in Pinellas County via Zoom during October. Those meetings they were probably about an hour for each meeting. There was so much. For the individuals who participated in those interviews, they ranged in time of administering the SPDAT from 2 months at that time through 5 years history of administering or experience of administering the SPDAT. The frequency at which they administered was from 0 to 40 months. 0 to 40 per month assessments of individuals. And in terms of training, all of them had gone through the regular training, the COC, a 3 or 4 day training, but some had completed that training a number of times over the years. The questions that I started with were, what has been your experience with using the VSPDAT? Are some people more or less likely to answer the questions on the VSPDAT tool? What parts of the tool do you think are most useful in assessing priority? What parts of the tool do you think are least useful in assessing priority? From your experience, what do you think would make the assessment process better for the person being interviewed? What would make the assessment process a better process for you as the assessor? And is there anything that should be done to make the tool more equitable? And I intentionally left that question for last. The themes that arose though were strongly about equity and access, about engagement of the individual being assessed, discomfort with some of the questions on parts of both the assessor and the client, how to ask the question, the necessity of some of the questions, and the reluctance and truthfulness of the client sharing their answers. So for equity, equity arose as issues among LGBTQ community and African American communities. And so remember, these are assessors. Some felt it takes time to build rapport with the LGBTQ community to develop trust. So that the person from that agency said, we may not assess a person from the community immediately, but we give them time to get settled into and the organization and to interact with them a few times so they feel more trusting and are able to answer the question. There was also an assessor who shared that, thinking about the county, the LGBTQ community were going to Clearwater from Largo because they didn't feel they were being accepted in Largo. So they felt they could get more authentic interaction and assistance from people in Clearwater. Some assessors shared that African Americans sometimes deny their mental health history when their history is known. So there was a particular assessor who had worked with individuals who they knew had a mental health history. When they asked the question about mental health history on the BS for that, they said, oh no, I don't, everything's fine. But they knew it. But as you're tallying the score, you're tallying the answers, you're answering what the person is sharing. And so that actually impacts their score. And more African American women with children were being assessed in street outreach. So the result, these issues of equity that arise kind of support what was found in the C4 innovation study, that this results in either communities not being assessed or their score is much lower. And in the next slide, you can see how this is even reflected in Pinellas County, where if you look at the orange in the top is scores for Black or African American in Pinellas County. And this is from the period, this is 1 month or a year's worth of data for October 2020 through September of 2021. The blue beneath the orange is the percentage of whites in their scores for the BS for that. And across the bottom is a score of 0 in the BS for that all the way up to 16. And the way I look at this slide and what I see when I look at this slide is that as you increase in score, you see a smaller percentage of Blacks that are being assessed at higher scores. And you see a higher percentage of whites that are being assessed and earning higher scores. And so this is what we see in our own CoC in terms of how inequity is showing up specifically in the BS for that tool. So going back to those conversations with the assessors, their engagement with individuals who are being assessed range from a business-like transaction, I have a set of questions for you, I need you to answer these questions, to, at the other end of that spectrum, more time building rapport and engagement. And this is a difference within our own CoC of how different assessors are engaging. So for example, one assessor says we meet with them 1 or 2 times before administering the SPDAT. So that's that engagement that we're seeing a little bit more. The type of engagement depends on the setting and the time available to build that rapport. But rapport building for some assessors was from the beginning considered important to truthful answers, but some felt it was more business procedure than a conversation. I had one assessor share that engagement is listening to their story. So and I'm sure if you've had experience administering the tool, people have the need or the tendency to want to elaborate on the question that's being asked. It's not satisfying or comfortable just to give a yes or no answer. They want someone to validate why they're answering yes or no. So hearing that story for some assessors was important to give that person space. Next slide. So there was also discomfort, as I mentioned, on the part of the staff and on the part of the client. And so for the staff, there was initial discomfort with asking the HIV/AIDS and the sex behavior questions. They felt the questions were offensive. Now, they feel like those questions are routine, so that speaks to how, if we felt it was offensive at one part, what has happened, then now it's not offensive, that it's considered routine, and what is that saying about the tool itself and our engagement with the client? They discern comfort of the client and they adjust their approach. So some assessors would see that a person was uncomfortable with the questions themselves or that engagement, and so they adjust it so that the person would experience more comfort. Assessor shared that her comfort makes it easier for the client. So she's more comfortable asking the questions the way she's, in her language pattern and her speech, then the client is more comfortable. And there was one person who shared that it's uncomfortable for her as an assessor to have a person who identifies as male and then have to ask that person, are you pregnant? So there's also some room in there for us to think about how we're, the questions that we need to ask and to whom we need to ask. The client was perceived by assessor as perceived by the assessor as feeling the need to explain themselves, and that's what I was just sharing about needing to substantiate that yes or no answer, especially when it came to questions about mental health and substance abuse, HIV/AIDS, and criminal justice history. There was one quote that was shared. It's like trying to use a crowbar to get them to admit they have taken money for sex. And as I spoke with other CFCs, or a few other CFCs across the nation, especially the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, we talked about how we have to consider the knowledge we gain from a client about themselves as a privilege, and as they are sharing a part of themselves, yes, to get help, and yes, we want to help them, but we aren't privileged as an agency to have to know anything about someone. So we have to see it as a privilege that they're willing to share. It's their choice to share. Another assessor, she felt uncomfortable asking personal questions. The client felt uncomfortable too. I just learned not to react. The more you ask, the more comfortable you get. So that speaks to, over time, how a person's comfort with asking the question has changed, but you're possibly interacting with a new person that's homeless, their comfort may not be equal or discomfort. The how of asking questions arose as a theme. So assessors have been trained to ask the questions verbatim. Wording of questions is an issue, however, and sometimes they need to be explained. So there was antiquated language that felt like using the wording drunk take, owe money to a bookie or dealer. Some questions were too wordy, for example, the pain pill question. They're trying not to re-traumatize, but it leads to unintended answers. So they're trying to, the questions were that the HIV/AIDS question is worded in a way to ask whether they would accept help, accept services for HIV/AIDS. And they're trying not to re-traumatize in the way that the after that question is worded, but people don't always understand the question, and so it has to be explained so that people that are answering really understand what's being asked. Some questions felt to be offensive, and they felt that the language needed to be changed to get them to answer. Necessity of questions was an area that rose up as a theme. There was some redundancy. We asked questions about things you've already gotten in the quota, and some questions are redundant because the answers you've already gotten, like alcohol or drugs. If they've already answered that question, you still have to wait for their answers. That speaks to our process of you have to get answers to all these questions. And yes, because it's a tool and we need to get a score, the questions need to be answered. But in the assessment work group, we're thinking, how can we word this so we get what we need and not have to keep coming back to that and then asking the same question again? There's a need of rewording, to reword some of the questions in order to house, for example, is your loss of housing due to physical, sexual trauma or any other trauma? And so a person shared, an assessor shared, a person's housing loss may not be due to trauma, but the loss has caused the trauma. If the client suffers from PTSD, the question may be a trigger because now they're thinking of their trauma history. So being careful about wording and what we're triggering. And are we gonna be able to respond to that in the moment? Do you have any physical disabilities that would make it hard to live independently? When I say, do you need assistance with living independently? Some may be able to live independently, but are in a wheelchair. You may need help, but stresses they can live independently. Or I can live on my own, but have a hard time remembering to pay my bills. Sometimes I have to ask the question the way it is, but add some more to help them understand. And the last theme on the last slide is reluctance and truthfulness. If they've been evicted due to a drug use or banned from a shelter, some of the questions have already been answered on the intake, and then they have to answer the questions again, and they answer different. So that's affecting their score. Some are involved in involvement of child protective services and may have seen violence. Some ladies and women are more reluctant to answer that question because they're afraid of where that question may lead and what impacts it could have on their family and their children. Some people answer the questions because they feel they have to get housing, as I shared with the person with lived experience. With the criminal justice questions, the assessor lets them know that they aren't going to run them for charges. That was a quote that she used. They feel clients are unlikely to answer the risk or Baker Act questions honestly. Several assessors shared that. And assessors felt the assessment needs room for their observations, especially if they contradict with the client's answers. So these are highlights from the scan that I did. But this scan and the information from this scan has now been taken and used and applied in the assessment work group that has been meeting for, oh my gosh, 6 months. Several months, I think since August of last year.
It'll be a year in June.
A year in June.
A year in June.
So we're using information in our assessment group process locally to prioritize equity in the questions that are being asked. So we're trying to use this information to develop questions that would reduce and hopefully eliminate inequities that have come up and we've seen in the that tool in the data. But I really feel like the questions that we've developed and that are shared in your packet, while there has been some input on those questions from persons with lived experience, it was difficult getting persons with lived experience engaged even in that process for varying reasons. But I think we still need to make a concerted effort to have another review before these questions are implemented as a tool in our community to be reviewed by persons with lived experience and have their feedback and input and their voices heard about how they feel, how they respond to these questions, and so that we're really not creating more inequities and perpetuating what we already have. And I support that these questions would be used in a pilot phase, much like Charlotte and Austin did, so that we look at the data as we have been doing, continue to look at the data and see, are we getting what we need? Are we really reducing inequities with these questions before we go and fully implement it throughout the COC? So thank you so much for your time, and I will definitely entertain your questions.
I just want to kick us off by saying I'm really, really proud of the work that not only Dr. Reed has done and Avery and her team, but all the providers that are participating in that assessment work group. I know this was a big chunk of time and we still have a lot of time for feedback, but this is one of the most significant changes that we will make as a community. And so it's really important that we wrestle with this and wrestle with it many times. So I know it went to providers recently. Some folks took the draft questions out of the packet to test with their staff, not with clients, and understand what they feel about it as someone who's an assessor. So, please don't be afraid to ask any question or provide any feedback, because this is gonna be a big process for us as a COC, and we want to get it right.
Got any questions about anything that Dr. Reed presented or any comments?
I just want a clarification question. Are you indicating that you would would not recommend these changes at this time, that we want to review process with the actual the homeless population.
I feel like before we implement any questions, even before we go to the pilot phase, the questions need to be reviewed by the homeless. And I think of reviewing them with the assessors is good too. Any feedback at this point on the questions themselves before they are implemented at all, I think is helpful. I think there's even room to do a pilot phase if it's difficult in getting responses from the homeless community before they go to pilot. The pilot is a test too, and it could give us some information on the wording of the questions and how the questions can be improved.
Thank you.
Go for it. Okay, trustee. One while this other support services, and we're part of the COC, but we just got our welcome pack to the HMIS stuff, and I really need to talk to someone after this about that. But you're talking about equity, and I house 300 homeless people daily, work over 100 people daily, and a high percentage of that is Black people, but I'm not in the database for you to see that. You know, I feed out 50,000 pounds of food a week, and almost all of that goes to the Black community. I'm in the CRA, the Black community. I shower probably 50 people a day. Most of them are Black. I clothe probably 100 people a day, and most of them are Black. But you're not getting any of that information because I'm not in the HMIS. So I'd love to be able to sit down and talk to you some more and get into the HMIS a little bit better. You know, you talked about referrals of people being on the emergency list. I house 100 people a day at a 16 apartment complex and 7 houses. I'd love for referrals to be right. I woke up this morning, I think we have 6 beds empty out of 300. Love to have more referrals and work with the community here instead of maybe just a hospital setting.
Appreciate that. We can talk offline about that, but you know, we're glad that you're here in the COC, and you know, we'll connect you with the HMIS stuff and figure out how we can best coordinate services. But we'll get to that.
Just a question I have, when you were going through this, and thank you for all the work that's been done on this, because trying to change the process and move to something new, I appreciate the deliberate nature of that. What kind of training, because of the sort of reluctance of people to answer questions sometimes, and I'm looking at the slide that you had about engagement, and you know, the conversation range from being pretty business-like to rapport building. What is the training for how this gets introduced before the assessment happens? How is it explained to folks who are, you know, what's the training around that? Because I do wonder, when you start to look at the questions that are asked, I mean, how you frame that up for people, you know, matters.
I'll let Avery speak to the training. I think one of the things we started a side conversation on in chat is the issue of our timing, right? So with the individuals, we don't assess immediately, and there's time to build rapport. With families, they must be assessed within 72 hours, and there is no time to build rapport. And so that likely changes some of it. I do think this idea, which Dr. Reed brought up multiple times, is this issue of having to ask the question exactly as it's written, which is the instructions for the VI SPDAT, and then it doesn't become a conversation.
And Duggan, most of the training comes through work when we were trained on VI SPDAT. So keep that in mind, is that we're still under that kind of stance. And org code was you cannot change the order in which the questions are asked. The questions are to be yes, no, 1-word answers. It should only take you 10 minutes. You have to read it verbatim. And how we kind of soften that is by telling everybody this is not a promise of housing. What we're looking at, and we're going to look at your whole person, but this is just going to help us determine what type of housing might be best suited for your situation. And that's how we introduce it. They also are allowed to skip questions. You know, we say ask for clarification is allowed. but ORCOD's training for us has been very strict. We have loosened that a little bit, maybe perhaps in the COC, because we need to. We need to be able to do that. In fact, ORCOD, right before they announced they were sunsetting, had said, okay, you can now go out of order if you need to. Just know that the questions were built to provide, to ensure that there won't be assessment fatigue. That's why we did it that way. So you can go out of order. If you do need to reword some things, okay, it's all right to go ahead and use language that might help. So they were starting to lift some of that up, and then they sunsetted and but the original question, assessors are trained to state this is not a promise for housing. This is merely a simple, quick tool for us to kind of gauge what might be the best housing option for your situation.
I just think as a pilot might get underway, part of what needs to be addressed through that is how this is framed up for people, and to see what strategies for framing that up might lead to, the best experience.
Because I'm sorry.
No,
I was also going to add the other issue that we don't want to continue is the inequity that comes out of the tool. So I agree with you, the piloting and developing the best practice for how it's framed, and the best practice for how, learning more about the questions and the wording themselves, but specifically in the questions where we're suggesting there's that assessor observation, until every provider really authentically goes through that race equity toolkit, there's still room for implicit bias in the way assessors observe and mark how they observe the client. So we don't want to perpetuate those inequities with a new tool that we're creating. So there's training even around how those questions should be answered and how a person should be making their observations and not allowing implicit bias to guide what they mark and score.
The work group is very concerned about training and how training will be framed around this. Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee actually provided some good feedback also, because they have been participating in Dr. Reed's work throughout the whole process. And they were saying, when we do point in time, we've all got a common script. And perhaps that's something that we need to work into that assessment so that it's even in HMIS, so that everybody is using that same common script in regards to what is the assessment, why is the assessment. But then practicing that script will be vital.
I might suggest, I don't know how you gained access to two people with lived experience that you interviewed, but if you go up to the third floor of the Clearwater Public Library, we have about 30 to 40 regular people come in every day. That's where they hang out. They're very respectful. They're on computers. It's air conditioned. And I would, although they don't really, I don't think they're going to represent families, right? They seem to be middle-aged, older, single people. But I think in that environment, that's their environment, that they feel comfortable with, it would be, a good place to conduct a question review with them. They have the time, and I think the comfort level is there.
Thank you for that, because I think at the time we were doing this, the main time that we were working on, or that I was working on the conversations with August to October. Numbers for COVID were spiking again, so that definitely impacted our ability to do in-person face-to-face. But you're right, now that
To meet them where they're at.
so we got 2 locations.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
This won't be the last time you see this work. It will be brought forward over and over again. So we just want to keep it front of mind so that you know what's happening.
Yeah, and I would just say, to kind of Doug's point where he was going, I think that's where we kind of need to head if we're implementing anything new. If you take a skilled assessor, I think they can get what they need to with any tool, if they're skilled at it. I know there's a balance to how do you get somebody up to that speed and whatnot, and training new individuals. So I would like to see some real work, maybe the COC can do, or the HLA can lead about, you know, assessing, like that's where the skill set to me comes in. And the tool being so prescriptive was I mean, I just look around the room, I think that was kind of setting us up for a little bit of failure there. I know, you know, we're ahead of a lot of other communities, and that's kind of eye-opening to hear, you know, what other communities are doing across the nation, and some aren't even to where we're at. So we're ahead of them, and we were looking for, you know, not an easy way, but a verified quantitative way to say, hey, how do we prioritize a list, right? And we found it and we did it, and now we're learning from it. So I think being less prescriptive and more responsive to meeting the individuals where we're at, but we're only going to do that with quality interviewers, assessors, because if you give somebody who's never assessed anybody before or has any experience with that, then what are they going to do? They're going to read the question and they're going to answer it, and they're going to go on to the next one. So I think that's where we can kind of shine as a COC, just from my opinion. But again, to reiterate, thank you, Dr. Reed and DEI and the subcommittees and everybody who's worked on this. We talked about this at the executive committee. This is innovation, right? So this is taking this another step. And again, this is DEI work, and ultimately this is trying to help serve the most vulnerable in our community. So like Amy said, this is just the beginning of this process, and we'll be seeing and hearing a lot more of it. So please pay attention to this. If you have any questions, or you want to see something tweaked, I'm sure you can reach out to Amy and kind of provide your feedback offline if you want to digest this. But thank you, everybody. Any other questions?
Or feel free to join the coordinated entry assessment work group.
Or join the work group.
If you're interested in that work, there is a great group already meeting, but there's room for others who are interested to join that work.
Great point. And, you know, kind of piggybacking off of that, that's where the work of our COC really gets done. That's where the heavy lifting gets done. So if you're interested, you know, at this meeting, we're typically having action on policies and vetting, but that's where the heavy lifting gets done. So please, if you're interested in that work or any other, the DEI or anything else that comes, join a committee and get involved. We don't have any action on that. And we will move on to, what are we on? Monitoring process? Yes. That's possible.
This is an informational item. Avery and Kaylee worked on updating the monitoring process and procedure document. Much of the requirements in here come directly from funders that we can't change. So that would be people like Department of Children and Families and HUD. But we felt like it was important for our providers to know what was going to be required of them up front. And oftentimes, you know, when you get monitored, you get that information a week or two in advance. So this is our attempt to make that process less painful, hopefully, where instead of doing 1 2-week process with a provider, we're going to look at certain things at an annual stop, certain things quarterly, and certain things when we're looking at client review files, for example. So hopefully by spreading that out a little bit, it's less staff intensive. I do believe there was something that made many providers excited, and that is if they are accredited, they do not have to have.
I'm not asking for all their policies and procedures.
So if you, as a provider or an accredited agency, you can provide copies of your accreditation that's current. and we will not go through all of your policies and procedures. So that should, you have to do that for other entities. So hopefully that will, take some time off. This is not something that you are going to approve because again, these are requirements of the pass-through funders that we pass through funding from. If you do have any concerns or questions about what you see here though, feel free to reach out to me or Avery and we can talk through that. This was really an informational item so that you would know kind of what to expect moving forward for monitoring from your COC. I guess as a side note, I would mention, I know I reached out to many providers last week for updates. So HUD is starting to send us spin down reports regularly and ask us to ask questions about those spend down reports and if they're not being spent down to reallocate. Interestingly enough, this is much like many bureaucratic government entities. As I've reached out to many of our providers to ask questions, they're a little confused because they report their challenges to HUD in a whole nother system. And then HUD doesn't give that to us when they give us the ELOCS reports. So they're having to do double work to explain that to us. But we'll work through this as we move through changing processes from HUD. We don't think we have any serious concerns that need to be brought to you or any need for reallocation at this time. But we wanted to at least make you aware of, in addition to the monitoring process that's required by HUD of us as the COC, they now are having us look at your spend down reports and ELOCs and ask questions about those things. So if something does arise that we feel like we need to bring to the board, we'll do that, but there's nothing at this time.
Questions, comments?
I have a question. The document is not before me, but didn't I read that there was some difficulty in a couple of funding situations where the money was not being spent down? I'm not sure what the issue was.
Yeah, good question, Trinia. So we are working on updating that funding document. That is not HUD dollars through the COC. There are significant issues with providers spending down HUD dollars that are passed through our local jurisdictions. That has been a hot topic. I think you missed last COC board meeting, and I think it was discussed at executive committee and then at providers. We are planning on funders meeting, if your funders chair agrees to it this month, having a section where providers can give some feedback to funders and funders can give some feedback to providers as well about their challenges. So if you're interested in that as a provider, I know many providers are struggling to follow all the processes that are different from every entity. There is an opportunity to give some of that feedback. And I can tell you funders are having that conversation and they do understand the challenges. Even in the jurisdiction meeting yesterday, the Foundation for Healthy St. Pete sent a letter to all of the entitlement communities to talk to them about their public engagement not being authentic. And it was well taken and they started having some discussions about how can they make that better in the future. I think the conversation is certainly being heard. And I think as a COC, we're going to create more opportunities for that feedback, but we will provide an updated document on that. And certainly I'd welcome any providers who, want to provide feedback around that.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, we'll move on to approval of the membership roster. This is in your board packet. We need to approve, the board approves the members of the COC. Just to kind of reiterate the process, members apply, or individuals and or organizations apply to become a member of the COC. It is then vetted through
myself and Councilmember Beckman.
the HLA, and Councilmember Beckman. You know, we have basic criteria, and then it comes on to be board approved. So all of these members have been vetted, but it is an action item, and I am happy to see Margie and Susan returning, who all know and love, to become a member of the COC after they've given so much to the COC themselves.
I would mention, this is kind of a cleanup item. So your charter requires that you vote on members annually. And many of our members joined in November. And so this was the next time we were able to get this on your agenda. But your membership is annual, it's a calendar year. And so even if people joined in November, we are about to launch our membership campaign for 2022. And you will need to rejoin. It is a requirement that you are a member to sit on any committee and register any votes. So that is going to be kind of our next cleanup item. Is we have quite a few committee members who may not be COC members, and we'll get that cleaned up as well. So this is kind of a retroactive cleanup item that you know, these members were members last year, and then you have our current 2022 members. We have not solicited you for 2022 membership yet because we have been changing the form and getting it in a different database. And so no one should feel like they're behind and not being a 22 member, even though it's March, because we've been trying to streamline our process. And that is now complete. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be ready to solicit you and say, time to rejoin. So that'll be coming up.
Just one edit on James fees. Mine and Beth's titles are flip-flopped.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will entertain a motion to approve the membership.
Second.
Was that Sam? I heard
Sam
first?
moved, Commissioner Flowers.
Flowers second. Any further discussion, comment? Hearing or seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed signify by saying nay. Hearing no nays, motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to announcements.
So I wanted to just have a section where we could follow up on things that you asked for or came up in other meetings. The family flow, I know some folks have said people outside of the COC need training on that. So that's going to be your next webinar in your non-policy setting month. So that will be April 1st. That's a Zoom meeting. So we'll present on that and we'll invite non-COC entities. So if you know folks, feel free to forward that with the Zoom information onto them so that the whole community understands how we get people into the system. Danielle Thomas asked last month and y'all voted to ask us to move forward with some advocacy for the Pinellas County Housing Authority. I've reached out to Miss Regina Booker and we are meeting around that. She's going to let us know how we can be helpful around that. So that is in progress. I also wanted to mention that Era Woodard from Largo and some others have been have a stakeholder group around Safe Harbor. That I've read a draft report, so that will come back to you at some point with some recommendations for Safe Harbor. As many of you know, Safe Harbor is run by our sheriff's office, and it is our largest shelter, jail diversion program in the county. And so that often changes the outcomes of our system performance measures because they're so large. What I've heard in the past is our sheriffs say, we welcome support, but with one case manager to 150 people, we're doing the best we can. So a group's been meeting around that and wanted to make you aware that that would be coming forward shortly. And I think you heard about open funding opportunities from Teresa earlier, but we wanted to make sure we know that there are so many different funding opportunities open right now. It's really hard for people to keep track. I've been trying to make sure we get that on social media and news and reach out to folks one-on-one if I know it's something that's in their wheelhouse, but we wanted to make sure we had a space this morning if any funders had anything to announce for funding opportunities.
I have a question. We put those funding opportunities, are they on your website? They show on the website?
They're probably not.
There's so many.
We can work towards that, yes.
Just the name and a contact, so you got to go through all of it.
Yes. We can work towards that, yes.
Okay.
Does anybody within any other announcements that any other board members may have?
Oh, I just have one. Carl Lavender and his team, along with representative from the League of Women Voters, contacted me along with other people in the community regarding the resolution that they are supporting dealing with health equity and equity and inclusion. I met with them, and then I met with staff, and we came up with, when I say we, I mean myself, Barry, Burton, and Jewel, we came up with a version of the resolution that would be most appropriate for where the county is and what we're doing. Parts of the resolution that has already been that was approved by the St. Pete City Council included information regarding the CBA, the Community Benefits Agreement, along with other components for minority contractors and subs, which we have not done. So that's the part that we took out because I didn't want to ask my colleagues to support a resolution on something we've not yet done a study on. But it allows me now to ask them to do that study. So we're moving forward with that. But look, I presented the language at the workshop yesterday to my colleagues. So we'll schedule that for a vote, and I'm hopeful that it will pass. So the majority of the resolution will deal with health equity and what the county wants to do forward. And then I'll probably be asking for persons to support in their own individual worlds for the county to actually do a study that addresses the inclusion of minorities. We have a real good SBA program. We have a real good economic development program. I think Dr. Cynthia Johnson has done a wonderful job making sure that minority subs are included. They're getting work, but I think to have something with a little bit more teeth in it, so that those contractors who try to skirt around that, they're not able to do so. Just wanted to. Well, I started with the Pinellas CoC. I was able to get the how to do business. I was able to get more minorities in the pipeline. I was able to get them to change so that any contract that was $2 million or under, as long as those individuals or vendors submitted their information, their insurance, their licensing, that it was on a rotating basis, so ensure that everybody got a little business. Was 10 points on your application. The school board said, have you done business with the school board before? So if you didn't do business, you lose those 10 points. And it just didn't make sense. So I was able to get that done before I left there. But I can't, try to.
Tell me what we name, but there's, thank you.
But yeah, I may be asking for your support. Certainly will give you more than enough time to read over the document and provide me your input about the language. But just trying to make sure, because I think if we can do that countywide, then developers, vendors, contractors can't say, we'll just go to this city, because they don't have that. If all of us do it, then they have to abide by it, because it's set in stone throughout the county. Thank you.
One other announcement I want to mention. So we had a lot of conversation at the last meeting about our veterans work. We've been deep diving into that system. I think one of the things that we'll be working towards in your charter changes this year is that those should not be separate from the COC, right? The COC designs the system and vets are a part of that system. So we are making sure everybody's aware, the leadership team for ending veteran homelessness. If anyone wants to be invited that hasn't been invited, that's for CEO level stakeholders who want to help end veteran homelessness. That is on March 16th. If you let me know and you haven't received anything, I will make sure you get invited. The packet will be going out on March 9th. We're really able to start seeing, you know, what some of the challenges are and need to start enacting policies that the COC drives to end our veteran homelessness, since we're behind the nation on that benchmark.
I'll also just throw out there to put on everybody's radar the North Greenwood CRA process. Councilman Beckman probably knows more about that, but I know a lot of individuals in this room have worked in the South St. Pete CRA and funding and all that kind of stuff. I think it's an important, it's going to be important for that community in the years to come. So that process is just starting community. Well, it hasn't just started. The community outreach of what the priorities for the CRA.
Is the intention to change it?
Change the priorities.
Yeah, for the CRA in Clearwater.
They've modeled the priorities after the St. Pete priorities.
They're creating a new CRA.
Okay.
It's a North Greenwood.
It's a second.
So it's text.
Yeah.
What was reported in the jurisdiction meeting yesterday was that Clearwater is looking at using some of their ARPA funds to seed that CRA, because, you know, it takes a while to generate funds, and that it will model St. Pete and be people focused, not brick and mortar focused.
Good.
And so you should see some social service options coming out of that.
But if you're a stakeholder or you live in the neighborhood, serve the neighborhood, it's important. So just putting that on the radar, the next community conversation, I think, is in April. I know the county is involved, obviously, the city of Clearwater. And then I think we have Ashley Lowry that has her hand up.
Yep, just a quick comment. I've mentioned before that we had a pot of money available for prevention for families due to COVID-related reasons. We were having trouble spending that funding down, believe it or not. So we were able to get it amended to include rental assistance for currently homeless families that are homeless as a result of COVID. So if anybody hears of a family like that, that would qualify. We don't really have tight restrictions about what COVID-related means. So it could be as simple as like even a 2-week break in employment due to COVID or something like that. And we'd be able to provide them with up to $2,500 per family with assistance to move into an apartment. And then additionally, we follow up with them for a year after they've received that assistance to make sure that they remain homed.
Awesome. I hope everybody heard that. Sam.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of the flexibility of COVID related. I know that there's some limitations on what we can't change the wording because that money doesn't come from us, but I just think it's really helpful to provide some guidance to people who might be applying, who need assistance of different kinds. I think people see COVID related and they're like, man, I didn't lose my job because of COVID. I was poor already. And they sort of are discouraged from applying. And I think how that's treated by the people taking the calls and how it would be great if we could provide some guidance to make that as inclusive as possible, especially for control spending money. And obviously people need money, need help, we needed help before COVID, and we didn't need help. So just how we can broaden that out as much as legally permissible. That would be great.
Great point, Sam. As much as legally permissible, I like that caveat there. Okay, not hearing any other announcements. We have our next meeting is going to be April 1st, April Fool's Day, which will be virtual system. It will be on the system flow. So important meeting, especially for our board members. who are just trying to wrap their head around all of what we do and how we do it. And then we will have our next meeting here, hybrid in May, focused on the HMIS charter and the review of the COC MOU. So without any other.
I forgot to say thank you to Amy and her staff. I did contact Amy, she was out of town, but Shannon, sorry, please forgive me. Shannon presented at the housing conference on issues surrounding veterans and housing. And Tom DeAmber I partnered him up with her because he has 8 units on St. Pete Beach that he only rents to veterans. And the VA has set up an arrangement with him where they actually send a counselor out. And so I was sad because not many more people went over there to their session. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And Trini said, I'm on the board, so yes, you did. So what I'm going to do for the next one is I'm going to make veterans housing one of the all-inclusive sessions. So the session where everybody is present, because we know it's an issue, we know homelessness is an issue. Sometimes people want the cute and sexy, not the neat piece. And so I just wanted to thank Amy, even though she was out of town, she made sure someone was there. Her PowerPoint, Shannon's PowerPoint was on point, and she did a wonderful job. I have all the photos back so I can upload some and send them to you. But I'm also creating a web page, and the YouTube link will you'll be able to view the conference over time. So if you want to go back and look at it and see the sessions or what have you, you'll be able to do that. But I felt a little sad for that. Also want to thank Mike Gelazzo. He and Kirk were there. And I'm looking for any other presenters in the room, but it took a whole lot of people to make it happen. And so I just wanted to thank those two individuals.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's what you said. I don't want to remember this of the town prior, but we probably must focus because the focus is gone from what I call the sturdy beggar. Sturdy beggar is a guy who's just homeless and Weaver's Park, no resources, being terrorized for a minute at this point by the COVID and goes to jail. If it wasn't for that sturdy beggar, the pitchfork and torch crowd would never have came out because they were the nuisance. They were the people who packed the city council meetings in the beginning, and I know because I was one of them. And so the thing about it is the numbers might go down, but the reflection of homelessness would never benefit if we don't have some solution to get people off of the street. And so more and more people are going on the street because they're sitting up in limbo until they run out of money for hotel rooms and such and such. And so I'm saying that there has to be some emphasis on the ordinary people who are sleeping on the street, who are peeing in the yards and worse than that, because they're dying now. There's not any funding for them. There's nothing for them. They shut the world. So what to do? Who did they see about that? I'm just saying.
Now, I appreciate GW always getting back to the realness of what's going on with individuals and families on the streets, street homeless, and the day-to-day realities and struggles of that. You know, to your point, and what we initially talked about in the beginning was St. Pete putting all, if majority, if not all of the money towards housing, some of that going directly towards homelessness, but it was because of the advocacy and people continuing to raise the issue and show up at council meetings and be active on the streets and social media and in these rooms and other places. So you're exactly right. And we're gonna keep working on it. Yes, ma'am.
Just to say, like, with that, I'm new, working with Glenn at Southern Services and Dr. D. And so we received a welcome packet from you and we'll follow up. But I'm just in writing the grants, a lot of the focus that I'm listening to is about housing. But with Southern Services, they're offering labor services as well as a food pantry and providing with the street people food and showers and things like that. Now, would that be considered value added, like in grants? Is it just focusing on the housing, or are you providing value added services to the community with the food pantry and helping the street people?
I mean, I think many of our providers have a whole array of services. We're sitting here as the CoC, and the CoC is responsible for permanent housing. And so that is our focus of this group. But certainly many funders like people to be able to get a whole array of services from a provider.
Okay, seeing, hearing no other comments, we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody who came and is online. Have a good month.
Thank you.